A woman is out for her morning walk along a quiet stretch of road on the edge of a Florida neighborhood, coffee in hand, when she notices it again. Tall, almost tree-like, with broad, star-shaped leaves the size of dinner plates, some of them a deep, almost wine-colored purple. It has grown up out of a patch of disturbed dirt near a drainage ditch, the kind of overlooked strip of land nobody tends to. She has seen this plant before, in a neighbor's front bed, planted on purpose for how dramatic it looks against a fence line. She has never once wondered what it actually is. It is called the Castor bean plant, Ricinus communis, and what she is looking at, whether she knows it or not, produces one of the most lethal natural toxins on the planet. Up close, the plant is easy enough to learn to recognize, and the details are worth holding on to. The leaves are large and deeply lobed, split into 5 to 9 pointed sections like an open hand, sometimes spanning close to 2 feet across on a mature plant. Their edges finely toothed and slightly glossy on top. Depending on the variety, they range from a plain waxy green to a deep bronze red or near purple, sometimes with a faint reddish sheen along the veins that shows up most clearly when sunlight passes through the leaf from behind. The stems are thick, hollow, and jointed, often carrying that same reddish tint, with a slightly waxy bloom on the surface that rubs off easily under a fingernail, and the whole plant grows fast enough that a single stalk can go from a seedling to a shrub, taller than a person within one warm season. Come mid to late summer, small greenish-yellow flower clusters appear near the top of the plant, the female flowers above and the male flowers below on the same spike, and these give way to the plant's most distinctive feature: clusters of round, spiky seed capsules, usually green but sometimes flushed red or deep purple, roughly the size of a large marble and covered in soft, harmless-looking spines that bear no resemblance to anything dangerous. Inside each capsule are typically 3 seeds, smooth, glossy, and mottled brown and cream, in a pattern that genuinely does resemble a tick, which is where the plant's scientific name comes from. The plant's appearance shifts noticeably with the seasons and with latitude, which is part of why it can be so easy to mistake for something else depending on where and when someone happens to see it. In the warmer parts of the country, from central Florida southward, the plant behaves as a true perennial, holding its leaves through the winter and growing steadily larger year after year until it resembles a small tree, sometimes reaching 30 or 40 feet, its lower stem thickening into something almost woody. In cooler regions farther north, the same species dies back completely each winter and simply returns from dropped seed the following spring, functioning more like a tall, unusually fast-growing annual weed that many homeowners assume they planted fresh that year, rather than a plant that has quietly reseeded itself in the same spot for a decade or longer. Handling any part of the plant carries its own smaller risk, separate from the seeds themselves. The pollen is considered highly allergenic and has been linked to asthma flare-ups in sensitive people, and simple contact with the sap, leaves, or flowers can cause skin irritation and rashes in some gardeners, long before anyone gets anywhere near the seeds. Identification guides note that at a glance, the large-lobed leaves can be confused with a handful of other big-leaved ornamentals people plant for the same dramatic effect, including a distantly related tree sometimes called the Castor aurelia, which shares a passing resemblance in leaf shape, but nothing else. The detail that actually separates castor bean from all of its lookalikes is the seed pod itself, that soft-looking cluster of spines wrapped around 3 mottled, tick-patterned seeds, a feature none of its more harmless doubles ever produce. Once someone has learned to recognize that single detail, the plant becomes almost impossible to miss in a yard, a vacant lot, or along a roadside, which makes it all the more notable how rarely anyone stops to look closely enough to notice it at all. Castor bean is not rare, and it is not hiding. It grows across roughly half of the United States, documented in states from California to Massachusetts, and it thrives especially well in the warm, humid conditions of the Southeast. In Florida specifically, it has been part of the landscape for an extraordinarily long time. Botanical records place it as naturalized in the state as far back as 1760, meaning it was already reproducing on its own, unaided by cultivation, more than 2 centuries before anyone tried to do anything about it. Today, the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences classifies it as a Category 2 invasive species, a designation meaning it is abundant and actively spreading throughout the state, but has not yet been shown to displace native plant communities at the level required for the more serious Category 1 label. It is found along roadsides, in old fields, on construction sites, anywhere soil has been disturbed enough to give its seeds an opening, and it tends to show up first in exactly the kind of overlooked, unmanaged ground that most people drive past without a second look. The strips of land nobody owns in any meaningful sense, and nobody is responsible for checking. Florida is far from the only state paying attention to it. Farther west, California's agricultural authorities separately classify castor bean as a noxious weed across the southern and central parts of that state, a designation arrived at independently for different regulatory reasons, decades apart from Florida's own listing. Beyond those two states, invasive species tracking databases document the plant as introduced or naturalized in a long list of others, stretching from the Gulf Coast through Texas and Arizona, up through the mid-Atlantic states, and as far north as New York and New Hampshire, generally following disturbed soil, riverbanks, and roadside corridors wherever the climate allows it to persist. National invasive plant surveys have logged it on public lands as far apart as national park units in the southeast, and scattered sites across the southwest, a spread wide enough that no single regional description really captures where the plant can now be found. Regional mapping projects that track invasive plant sightings county by county continue to log new occurrences of the species every year, a slow, ongoing accumulation of data points rather than a single completed survey, which is part of why estimates of its true range tend to creep upward over time rather than settle on a fixed number. A man kneeling at the edge of his own vegetable garden, a few states away, somewhere in the dry heat of central Texas, is pulling weeds from around a row of tomatoes when his hand brushes against a plant he assumed was just an overgrown decorative shrub someone planted years before he bought the house. The leaves are broad and star-shaped, deep green with a faint reddish cast along the veins, and a cluster of small, spiky seed pods hangs near the top, still green, not yet split open. He has no gloves on. He tugs a strand of Bermuda grass free from underneath it, brushes a smear of the plant's own sap off the back of his wrist without a second thought, and by evening notices a faint rash along that same patch of skin, the kind of thing easy to blame on the heat or on poison ivy somewhere else in the yard. He moves on to the next row, never once looking twice at the plant towering quietly behind him. Part of what makes it so easy to overlook is that it does not look like a threat. It looks like landscaping. Cultivated varieties are sold under names like Carmencita and New Zealand Purple, prized for their size, their color, and how fast they grow, sometimes reaching 30 or 40 feet in warm climates where frost never touches them. Garden centers and mail-order seed catalogs alike often describe it in purely aesthetic terms, as a bold architectural accent or a fast privacy screen. Language built entirely around how a border or a bare fence line will look once it fills in, with no mention anywhere in that description of what the plant is actually capable of. People plant it on purpose in their own yards for the same reason that woman's neighbor did. It is dramatic. It fills space quickly, asks for almost no maintenance once established, and tolerates poor soil that would struggle to support most other ornamentals. It looks, in every visible way, exactly like landscaping, and nothing about a description like that hints at what is waiting inside the seed pods once they mature. What it is not is harmless. Inside the plant's seed pods are the actual castor beans, mottled brown and roughly the size of a large tick. And packed inside those beans is a protein called ricin, one of the most potent toxins known to affect human cells. Ricin works by targeting the ribosome, the machinery inside every cell responsible for building proteins the body needs to function. A component of the toxin called the A chain enters the cell and makes a single, precise, irreversible chemical alteration to the ribosome's structure, while a separate component allows the toxin to latch onto the outside of a cell in the first place and get pulled inside. Research first published by Fodstad, Olsnes, and Peel in 1976 demonstrated that a single molecule of this toxin, once inside a cell, is enough to permanently halt that cell's ability to produce proteins at all. There is no repairing it. The cell simply stops, and once enough cells stop, tissue and eventually whole organs begin to fail behind it, which is why symptoms in a serious case tend to arrive gradually rather than all at once. By weight, some sources describe purified ricin as roughly twice as lethal as Cobra Venom, When accounting for injected or inhaled exposure specifically, the gap widens considerably further, with some comparisons putting it several hundred times more toxic gram for gram. Public health agencies place the lethal dose at a level small enough that, if inhaled or injected in purified form, an amount equivalent to just a couple of grains of table salt could be enough to kill an adult, a figure that sounds almost impossible for something extracted from an ordinary garden plant. Most people walk past without a glance. It is genuinely one of the most dangerous substances a garden plant has ever produced, and unlike most things capable of that kind of harm, this one is legal to grow, legal to own, and, in most of the country, entirely unregulated at the level of the plant itself. That same toxic seed, stripped of the plant around it and pressed for its oil, also sits at the center of a very different, very legal industry that most people encounter constantly without realizing it. Castor oil extracted from these seeds is a genuine global commodity. India alone accounts for roughly 80 to 85% of the world's castor oil production, with China and Brazil supplying most of the remainder. And the oil moves from there into pharmaceutical capsules, skin and hair care products, industrial lubricants, biodegradable plastics, and specialty coatings used across the automotive and aerospace industries. Refined, pharmaceutical-grade castor oil shows up in laxatives and topical ointments sold over the counter, while cosmetic-grade versions are a common ingredient in lip products, mascaras, and moisturizers, valued for a thick, glossy texture that comes from the oil's unusually high viscosity. Industrial-grade versions go into high-performance lubricants and greases prized for staying stable across extreme temperatures, into certain bioplastics, biodiesel blends, and protective coatings, and into chemical processes that would otherwise rely more heavily on petroleum. One specific derivative, a bio-based engineering plastic known as nylon 11, is synthesized directly from castor oil and used commercially in automotive fuel lines, industrial tubing, and sporting goods precisely because of properties that make it resistant to heat and chemical exposure. None of this depends on some rare or specially cultivated strain of the plant. The seeds pressed for industrial castor oil abroad are, botanically speaking, the same species growing wild along a Florida roadside, or planted deliberately in a Texas front yard, the only meaningful difference being scale, intent, and what happens to the seed after it leaves the plant. The processing that removes the ricin from the oil is thorough and well established, and the finished product carries none of the seed's danger. But the raw material for that entire global supply chain is the same mottled, tick-shaped seed, sitting in a spiky pod above that Texas gardener's tomato patch, on a plant nobody there ever registered, licensed, or reported to anyone. So, how many people does this actually affect? More than a passing curiosity would suggest, and more than the plant's quiet, decorative reputation would ever hint at. A review of medical literature going back over a century documented 424 cases of castor bean poisoning, the overwhelming majority tied to chewing or swallowing the raw seeds, with cases turning up in hospital records across multiple continents rather than clustering in any one region. 14 of those documented cases ended in death, nearly all of them in patients who never received treatment, putting the untreated mortality rate at just over 8%. Once modern hospital care, activated charcoal, and fluid support entered the picture, that rate dropped to well under 1%, a gap that says less about the toxin becoming weaker over time and more about how much a straightforward trip to an emergency room changes the outcome. That gap between untreated and treated outcomes shows up clearly in more recent data too, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. A statewide poison control review covering exposures reported between 2001 and 2011 found dozens of documented cases, most of them unintentional, and most involving children who found seeds in a yard or garden and put them in their mouths the way children do with anything small and unfamiliar. Vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, and stomach pain were the most common symptoms reported, and the majority of admitted patients were released within a day or two once symptoms were brought under control. Not one of the documented cases in that decade-long review ended in death, which says something important about this plant that a raw toxicity number alone does not capture. Oral absorption of ricin is strikingly unpredictable, shaped by how thoroughly a seed gets chewed, how big it is, even where it was grown. A seed swallowed whole may pass through with barely a symptom. A seed chewed thoroughly is a different situation entirely, as one case published by physicians at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh in 2017 illustrates, involving a teenager who deliberately blended roughly 200 beans into juice and survived, but only barely, and only with intensive supportive care. Children are not the only ones at risk from a curious mouth in the backyard. A review of 98 castor bean ingestion cases in dogs, compiled by the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals National Animal Poison Control Center and covering cases reported between 1987 and 1998, found that vomiting, lethargy, and diarrhea were the most commonly reported symptoms, and that death or euthanasia occurred in roughly 9% of those cases. Veterinary sources describe symptoms typically emerging somewhere between 12 and 48 hours after a dog or cat eats the seeds, a delay that can make the connection to a chewed seed pod in the yard easy to miss until a pet is already seriously ill. As with humans, the outcome for an animal seems to depend heavily on whether the seeds were swallowed whole or thoroughly chewed, since crushing the tough outer hull is what releases the Ricin inside. Veterinary toxicologists note that even a single well-chewed seed has been enough to kill a small dog, and severe cases can progress to bloody diarrhea, oral irritation, tremors, and organ failure well before an owner realizes what happened. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals lists the plant as toxic to dogs, cats, and horses alike, with access to ornamental specimens or pruned foliage cited as the most common way pets end up exposed in the first place, which puts the risk squarely in the same backyards and front beds where people plant the thing for how it looks. Diagnosis in a veterinary clinic can be its own challenge, since a pet showing up with sudden vomiting and bloody diarrhea rarely arrives with an owner who witnessed anything, let alone identified a plant, which is part of why veterinary toxicology literature specifically flags castor bean as a cause worth considering, even when there is no known history of exposure to household plants at all. In at least one published case, veterinarians confirmed a fatal ricin poisoning in a puppy only after laboratory testing detected the toxin's chemical marker in the animal's system, underscoring how easily a case like this can be missed without that kind of specific testing. A woman 2 states over is walking her retriever along a wooded trail one afternoon when the dog noses into a patch of undergrowth near the tree line and comes up with something small and hard clenched between its teeth. She pries the dog's jaw open out of habit, more annoyed than worried, and tosses aside a handful of what looks like oddly patterned beans scattered loose from a split, spiky pod, half hidden in the leaf litter nearby. She checks the dog's mouth once, sees nothing obviously stuck or swallowed, and decides there is nothing worth cutting the walk short over. The dog trots on ahead, tail wagging, sniffing at the base of a tall, star-leaved plant, standing a few feet off the trail, and she calls him back toward the path without ever once glancing up at what he had been sniffing, or noticing the same spiky pods scattered in small clusters for another 20 feet along the tree line. It is worth being honest about why a substance this toxic is not simply banned outright. In 2001, members of the Florida Nursery Growers Association voted unanimously among themselves to stop selling the plant commercially, a decision made entirely within the industry, not by any court or legislature. It was a meaningful step, but it was also a narrow one. The vote restricted a trade agreement among growers. It did not, and does not, make it illegal to grow the plant from seed, to let it self-seed in a disturbed corner of a yard, or to order seeds through a catalog, which remains entirely legal and simple to do today. The plant itself was never the part anyone managed to draw a hard line around. Only its sale in Florida nurseries was. That gap has not closed with time, it has simply moved into the present tense. As of the most recent Florida Invasive Species Council plant list, castor bean still carries its Category 2 designation, and Florida's own state agriculture department does not list it as a noxious weed at all, a formal category that would carry its own separate restrictions. California continues to classify it as a noxious weed in its southern and central counties, while plenty of other states where the plant now grows have no listing or restriction on it whatsoever, leaving its legal status essentially a patchwork that shifts depending on which state line someone happens to be standing on. There is no federal law today that restricts who may grow the plant, collect its seeds, or move them across state lines, and no permit, license, or registration of any kind attaches to owning it, in sharp contrast to the small number of truly regulated agricultural toxins that require paperwork before anyone may legally possess them. Invasive plant databases continue to track and update where the species has been spotted, county by county, but tracking a plant's spread is not the same thing as restricting it, and nothing about being logged in a database changes what a person may legally grow in their own yard. A homeowner today can walk into the same situation as that 1760 Florida record, planting or tolerating a self-seeding population with no paperwork, no inspection, and no one outside their own property ever aware it is there. The same is true 2 states over, 3 states over, in whichever direction the plant happens to have ORSC taken root, since state-by-state variation in listing status has never translated into any kind of coordinated national tracking of who is actually growing it. In practice, the plant's legal status today is barely different from what it was the day before that 2001 vote. What changed was a handful of nursery shelves. What did not change was the plant. That gap between what is restricted and what is actually accessible is exactly what makes this plant more than a gardening curiosity. It is worth being direct, briefly, about where that gap has led before. In 2013, a Texas woman ordered castor beans through an online seed catalog, the same kind gardeners use every day, and used them to produce ricin that she mailed to a sitting president and a sitting mayor. It remains one of the clearest illustrations of how little stands between a backyard ornamental and something federal investigators classify as a bioterrorism agent. Similar ricin-laced letters turned up in postal facilities and a Senate mailroom a decade earlier, in 2003 and 2004, incidents that, to this day, were never definitively solved. These cases are not the reason to know about this plant. They are simply proof of what happens on the rare occasion someone decides to use what is, for almost everyone else, just a tall, striking plant with red-purple leaves growing wild by the road. For nearly everyone who ever encounters castor bean, the real risk is not deliberate. It is a child in a backyard, a dog that gets into a fallen seed pod, a gardener pulling weeds without gloves near a plant they never identified, a hiker whose retriever noses into the wrong patch of undergrowth. The danger is not hidden in some rare or exotic corner of the country. It is naturalized across roughly half of it, has been for over 200 years in Florida alone, and continues to spread on its own through disturbed soil with no help required from anyone who plants it on purpose. It sits, unremarked, in front yards, along fence lines, beside vegetable patches, and at the edge of hiking trails, at the same time as it sits, refined and stripped of everything dangerous, in the pharmaceutical capsules and skincare bottles in millions of bathroom cabinets on the other side of the planet, and in the fuel lines and tubing of cars, most of those same people drive every day without ever thinking about what any of it came from. Both versions of this plant are entirely real, entirely legal, and entirely ordinary, and most people will go their whole lives encountering one, the other, or both, without ever learning they came from the exact same seed, grown in a garden or a field, chewed or pressed, depending only on which hand happened to reach for it. Back on that quiet road, the woman finishes her coffee and keeps walking, the plant still standing there behind her, tall and undisturbed, its broad star-shaped leaves catching the morning light. Nothing about it looks any different than it did 5 minutes ago. Nothing about it will look any different tomorrow, or next year, or to the next person who walks past and, like her, has no particular reason to wonder what it actually is.